There are stories in history that end not with thunder, but with a whisper. Stories where the final breath of an age slips quietly into the night, like frost settling on forgotten windows. And among these stories, none glows quite so softly, so tragically, as that of the Romanovs. They were the last imperial dynasty of Russia. 300 years of power, now reduced to a family portrait fading at the edges. Their downfall wasn't just a political collapse. It was the quiet unraveling of a world that once believed in tsars, in snow-covered courts, in divine rights stitched into silk. Picture it, dear dreamer, St. Petersburg under a pale grey sky. Gold domes glinting faintly in the cold. The Neva River moving slow as syrup through a city caught between centuries. And within the grand walls of the Alexander Palace, a family in twilight. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, not a tyrant, not a hero, but a quiet, bookish man who loved his children more than he ever understood his people. Alexandra, his wife, a German-born empress haunted by prophecy and pain, clinging to mystics and miracles in a desperate search for hope. And their children, oh, the children. Older, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, radiant, restless, real. And the youngest, little Alexei, heir to a broken throne, hemophiliac prince whose blood refused to clot, whose life became his mother's silent war. But the world outside their palace walls had grown louder, hungrier. It roared with revolution, with breadlines and bullets, with red banners and the ghosts of serfs long forgotten. The empire was cracking, not suddenly, but slowly, like ice before a thaw. Tonight, dear dreamer, we won't rush. We'll drift, as gently as snow, through the final days of this once mighty house. Through candlelit dinners and whispered prayers. Through Rasputin's shadow and Lenin's rise. Through the train cars, the exile, the cellar. We'll walk beside the Romanovs, not as rulers, but as a family, fragile and flawed, facing the end. You won't need to keep track of dates. Let time blur. Let facts dissolve into feeling. For this isn't just history, it's memory. A lullaby for an empire lost. So close your eyes. Breathe softly. The snow is falling again. The halls of the Winter Palace are silent now. Only echoes remain. Let us follow them. And before we step into that quiet past, I'd like to ask you something. If this story finds you tonight, I invite you, gently, to subscribe, like, share, or leave a thought in the comments. It helps this little lantern of history glow just a little brighter. Before we dive into today's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Because I know that you, me, and everyone else tuned into this video, we all share the same little habit, even if we're scattered across the world, far from one another. We listen at night, when the world is hushed and the past leans in. It begins not with a coronation, but with hesitation. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, known to history as Nicholas II, never truly wanted to be Tsar. On the morning of his father's death in 1894, Nicholas wept not with ambition, but with fear. He whispered, almost childlike, "I am not ready. I do not know how to be emperor." And perhaps, dear dreamer, he never would. Born in 1868, Nicholas was the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, a towering, iron-willed autocrat who ruled Russia with a clenched fist. His father believed in strength, in discipline, in order. He distrusted reform, feared revolution, and ruled as if history could be held still. Nicholas, in contrast, was quiet, polite, gentle. He loved long walks in the countryside. He read Shakespeare in English and kept meticulous diaries, not of grand political events, but of weather, meals, and family outings. He was a man of habit, not vision. A husband and father first, ruler second. And yet, history does not wait for readiness. When his father died unexpectedly, the 26-year-old Nicholas found himself on a throne that spanned 1/6 of the earth, an empire of 130 million souls, dozens of languages, and ancient unrest. An empire ripe with contradiction, opulence and famine, cathedrals and prisons, champagne in crystal goblets and children with bare feet in the snow. Nicholas's coronation in 1896 was supposed to reassure the people, but fate, cruel as ever, had other plans. During the festivities, thousands of peasants gathered at Kodinka Field near Moscow for free food and gifts. The crowd surged. Panic broke, and over 1,300 people were trampled to death. The new Tsar, advised to proceed with the planned ball that night, did so, a choice that would shadow him forever. They called him Nicholas the Bloody, not for cruelty, but for carelessness. Still, within the walls of his private life, he was anything but careless. He adored his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, with a devotion that surprised his court. To him, she was more than empress, she was his anchor, his moonlight, his quiet salvation. Their letters were filled with tenderness. "Sunshine of my life," he would write. "My own precious wifey," she'd reply. It was a rare, aching intimacy, the kind history often forgets when it writes of crowns and coups. And so, dear dreamer, the early years of his reign passed in fragile stillness. A Tsar who wished to be left alone with his family. An empire that could no longer afford to wait. The walls of the palace were warm, but the air beyond them grew colder by the year. And as Nicholas walked with his daughters through the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, revolution stirred in whispers, in factories, in prisons, in poems passed hand to hand by candlelight. History was waking up. And so, as the quiet Tsar walked toward fate, another shadow stretched long behind him, a foreign-born empress, and the loneliness that would shape a throne. She was born Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, raised among the lilacs and lace of a quiet German duchy. Her childhood was marked by loss. Her mother, Princess Alice, died when Alix was only 6, and the sorrow of that absence never truly left her. It wrapped around her like fog, elegant and silent. She was beautiful, yes, with high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a proud, quiet dignity, but she was not made for crowds. Shy, devout, introspective. Her heart was a cathedral, not a ballroom. And yet, fate would not allow her to hide. When she first met Nicholas, Nicky, as he would become to her, she was only 12. He 16. A chance meeting among cousins, royalty mingling at some stiff British affair. But for Nicholas, it was the beginning of something that would never let go. He fell in love with her slowly, but with a depth that endured. Years passed. She grew into a woman, he into a future Tsar. And when his father finally relented, their union was sealed, not with pomp, but with whispered vows of devotion. She took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. She took the Orthodox faith. And she took upon herself a burden heavier than any crown, to be empress of a people who never fully welcomed her. The Russians called her cold, haughty, aloof. She rarely smiled in public, rarely indulged in society's games. She disliked the lavish Petersburg court and preferred the quiet of Tsarskoye Selo, where she could raise her children without the noise of politics or the sharpness of courtly tones. But her greatest trial came not from whispers, it came from love. The birth of her first child, Olga, in 1895 was joyful. Then came Tatiana, in 1897, Maria in 1899, Anastasia in 1901. Each daughter a miracle. Each birth celebrated, then gently mourned. For they needed a son. The empire's laws demanded a male heir. And so, while Alexandra adored her girls, she lived under a silent weight, the pressure to deliver Russia a future Tsar. A child who would continue the Romanov line. That child finally arrived in 1904. Alexei. A tiny, perfect boy, and her heart broke open with joy. But soon, very soon, that joy turned to fear. He bruised easily. He bled too long from small cuts. And then came the diagnosis, whispered like a curse through palace halls: hemophilia. A royal disease. A death sentence in slow motion. Alexandra's entire world narrowed to that boy. She became obsessed with his health, isolated from court, from friends, from even her husband at times. She prayed. She fasted. And eventually, she reached for something, or someone, far more dangerous. A mystic. A peasant. a man from Siberia who would come to be both her solace and her undoing. But not yet. For now, dear dreamer, imagine her, alone in her chambers, pale candlelight flickering against gold-leafed icons, whispering desperate prayers for the child asleep in the next room. A mother. An empress. A woman caught in the storm. And so, as her hope grows desperate, another presence stirs beyond the palace gates, rough-bearded, wild-eyed, walking barefoot through the frost toward destiny. Imagine, if you will, a man arriving not in a carriage, but in visions. He was born Grigory Yefimovich Novik in a cold Siberian village called Pokrovskoye, far from the glimmering chandeliers of imperial courts, where wolves howled louder than bells and the stars felt closer than kings. As a young man, he wandered, not just across land, but across faith. He dabbled in sex and solitude, in pilgrimages and prophecy. He was illiterate, unwashed, and inexplicably magnetic, equal parts prophet and charlatan, sinner and savior. Wherever he went, he gathered stories, followers, suspicions. And by the time he reached the gates of St. Petersburg in 1905, he had become something else entirely. Rasputin, the mad monk. Some would call him, though he was never truly a monk, and his madness, well, that's harder to say. To the Romanovs, he came first as a rumor, then as a name spoken in hushed tones among courtiers, and finally as a last resort, a candle in a darkened room. Alexei had suffered a terrible fall. The boy was in agony. Doctors could do nothing. His fever climbed. His joints swelled. Alexandra, frantic and hollow with despair, was told of the wandering healer from Siberia, a peasant who could pray pain away. She sent for him. He arrived quietly, without fanfare, without fear. He stood beside the boy's bed, whispered prayers, touched his forehead, told the empress to dismiss the doctors, to let the boy rest. And then, somehow, impossibly, Alexei's bleeding stopped. His fever broke. He began to recover. Was it hypnosis? Coincidence? A gentle voice and a mother's need to believe? It did not matter. To Alexandra, Rasputin was a miracle wrapped in rags, a sign from God, a shepherd sent to guide her son. And from that moment on, dear dreamer, Rasputin was not merely an advisor. He became family, intimate, essential. The imperial court recoiled. They saw a coarse, unkempt peasant in filthy robes, kissing women's hands, whispering in the empress's ear. Rumors bloomed like frostbite, of orgies, blackmail, hypnosis, possession. Of a man who could not die, who seduced nobles and nuns alike, who drank like a demon and healed like a saint. But Alexandra did not waver. The more they warned her, the tighter she clung. And Nicholas was torn. He trusted his wife. He did not love Rasputin, but he loved Alexandra. And the boy, his beloved Alexei, was alive. So Rasputin stayed. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of decay, of divine right gone to rot. In taverns and tenements, people whispered, if that Tsarina listens to him, who really rules Russia? By the time war broke out in 1914, Rasputin's influence was no longer a secret. And as Russia bled on the battlefields, as soldiers froze and factories emptied, the Romanovs stayed in their gilded cage, guarded by a holy man with haunted eyes. The people were growing restless. And so, as Rasputin's shadow lengthened across the throne, another storm gathered in the streets. Red flags raised, hunger in their bellies, fire in their hands. It was a summer of flags and foolish hope. In August 1914, as the Great War began to pull Europe into its maw, Russia marched forward with brass bands and open hearts. Young men in crisp uniforms waved to mothers and brides, believing they'd be home by Christmas. Peasants cheered. Priests blessed regiments. The Tsar, stiff in his white uniform, rode through the streets with a bittersweet pride. But war is never as brief as promised. And the Russian bear, though vast, was slow and wounded. The empire entered World War I with grandeur but little preparation. Its army was enormous in number but weak in supply. Many soldiers carried no rifles, only hope that they might pick one up from the fallen. boots were shared. Ammunition was scarce. Logistics, always Russia's haunting flaw, faltered under the weight of distance and cold. At first, there were victories. Cheers. Then came defeat, and not a quiet one. At Tanneberg in August 1914, over 100,000 Russian troops were lost in a single, shattering blow. The enemy, Germany, sleek and brutal, outmaneuvered them. And from that moment on, dear dreamer, the war became a slow and bloody waltz of attrition. Back home, the costs grew unbearable. Food prices soared. Bread lines stretched for hours. Men died at the front. Their wives wept in silence. Factories strained under impossible demands. And through it all, the Tsar remained oddly distant, loving, yes, but absent. His diary still noted the weather, the tea, the family walks. As if war had not cracked the world in half. Then, in 1915, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Nicholas left St. Petersburg to take personal command of the army. He was not a skilled commander. He had no great strategic mind. But he believed it was his duty, a divine responsibility. He thought, perhaps, that his presence would inspire the troops. That loyalty could win where tactics had failed. Instead, it only severed him from the heart of the empire. While Nicholas was away at the front, command passed unofficially to Alexandra. And behind her, Rasputin. Ministers were dismissed, appointed, dismissed again. Political chaos gripped the capital. Duma members, once mild and monarchists, now began to mutter of reform, of abdication, of change. And the people, oh, the people, they no longer saw a father in their Tsar. They saw a ghost. A man far away, fighting a war that felt endless, pointless, foreign. A man who led a foreign-born empress in a wild-eyed mystic whisper in the halls of power. Revolution did not burst forth all at once. It crept. Like winter. Like hunger. And so, dear dreamer, as Nicholas pored over maps in his field tent, as Alexandra clutched icons and begged saints for her son's safety, the empire began to die, not with the sword, but with silence. And in that silence, the people began to stir. Another page turns, and now, we step into a darker corridor, one where candles flicker low, and conspirators gather beneath marble ceilings. It was nearly Christmas, 1916. Snow had fallen thick across the rooftops of Petrograd, the renamed capital, no longer allowed to bear its Germanic st, with war grinding on. The Neva froze hard. The lamps glowed dim. And beneath the opulent chandeliered hush of the city, something far older than politics was taking shape, a plot. Grigory Rasputin had outlived rumors and poison, scorn and scandal. For over a decade, he had walked the tightrope of favor and fury. Some worshipped him. Others wished him to vanish. But by now, dear dreamer, even the patience of Russia's nobility had worn thin. To them, Rasputin was no longer just an embarrassment. He was a danger. A symbol of everything rotting at the core of the Romanov court. A man they believed whispered policy in the Tsarina's ear. A disease to be cut out before it infected the nation beyond repair. And so, in the grand halls of the Yusupov Palace, a mansion of gold mirrors and velvet silence, the trap was laid. Prince Felix Yusupov, eccentric heir to one of Russia's richest families, played the host. He was young, charming, married to the Tsar's niece. And behind his smile, he hid a conspirator's heart. Alongside him, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Nicholas himself, and several others lurking in shadow. They invited Rasputin under the pretense of pleasure, an evening of song, perhaps of conversation. A beautiful noblewoman, they said, would be waiting to meet him. He accepted, perhaps flattered, perhaps curious. Or perhaps, as some said, he already knew. On the night of December 29th, Rasputin stepped through the palace doors. Downstairs, in the cellar, they had prepared sweet cakes laced with cyanide. Wine, too, red and heavy with death. Rasputin smiled, laughed, ate, drank, and yet, nothing. He did not die. The conspirators panicked. Felix excused himself, retrieved a revolver, returned and shot Rasputin once, in the chest, they claimed. The monk collapsed. They breathed. It was done. But when they returned hours later, Rasputin's body stirred. He gasped. He rose. He fled into the snow. They chased him through the courtyard, the frost catching in his beard. They shot him again. And again. And when he still breathed, they beat him. Bound him. And threw his body, still twitching, they swore, into the icy waters of the Neva. His corpse was found days later. One hand, it was said, frozen above his head, as if he had tried to claw his way out from beneath the ice. The autopsy would dispute much. Perhaps the poison never worked. Perhaps the stories were embroidered with fear, with drama, with the desperate hope that they had finally rid themselves of a ghost. But it was no victory. Alexander wept. Nicholas, informed at the front, mourned silently. And the people? The people did not cheer. For all his madness, Rasputin had been merely a symptom. And the sickness was deeper. The empire did not heal. It fractured further. And so, as Rasputin's body sank into the river's frozen grip, the Romanovs faced a new storm, one that came not from shadows, but from the open roar of revolution. The frost had lost its charm. By February 1917, Petrograd, once St. Petersburg, was brittle with hunger and smoke. The Great War, that endless machine of death, had drained not just blood, but belief. Belief in the Tsar. Belief in the empire. Belief in the old ways that once held the world upright. And so the city waited, cold, starved, and watching. There were signs, as there always are. Bread riots. Factory strikes. Long lines of women wrapped in wool, cradling empty pails and fury. But the government, so long insulated by velvet and gold, barely stirred. The Tsar was still at the front. Far from the noise. Far from the smoke rising from the rooftops of his capital. On March 8th, International Women's Day, it began. Thousands of women marched through Petrograd demanding bread, peace, justice. They were not radicals, at least not yet. They were mothers, widows, sisters of the fallen. But when workers from the factories joined them, the streets began to swell. They chanted. They defied police orders. They smashed bakery windows. They clashed with troops. And the next day, and the next, the marches became floods. Soldiers were ordered to fire upon the crowds. Some did, but others, cold, hungry, disillusioned, refused. Some even turned on their officers. The line between state and people blurred, collapsed. By March 12th, the Petrograd garrison, the very force meant to protect the throne, had mutinied. Ministers were arrested. Prisons opened. The Duma, once a feeble advisory council, declared a provisional government. A new flag was hoisted over the Tauride palace. And in Tsarskoye Selo, Alexandra sat paralyzed with disbelief. She sent telegrams to Nicholas, frantic, bewildered. The situation is serious, but not dangerous, she wrote at first. But soon, even she knew the tide had turned. Nicholas tried to return to the capital, but the train lines were blocked. His generals advised resignation. His ministers begged him to step down, not just for his own sake, but for Russia's. To preserve the army, the empire, the dynasty. And so, on March 15, 1917, Nicholas II, Tsar of all the Russias, father of the nation, autocrat by the grace of God, abdicated. He did so without drama, without a crown. He simply wrote it down, in neat, tired handwriting, and signed his name. Not for himself. For his son. For his brother. But even they would not rule. The Romanovs were no longer sovereigns. They were now guests. Prisoners. Symbols of a past that Russia was trying, with trembling hands, to bury. In the Alexander Palace, their world shrank. Guards now lined the halls. Letters were read. Servants dismissed. The imperial family, once wrapped in silks and ceremony, now lived in sweaters and silence. But they were together. And so, dear dreamer, the storm has struck, but it is not yet the end. For the Romanovs are still a family, still breathing, still waiting. And exile, that long grey corridor, has only just begun. The gilded doors did not slam shut all at once. In the days after Nicholas's abdication, the Romanovs remained in the Alexander Palace, their home at Tsarskoye Selo. But something had shifted. The empire had cracked, and now even their familiar walls seemed colder, quieter. The guards came next, not as invaders, but as wardens in green-grey coats, with stiff expressions and watchful eyes. The imperial family, once waited on by hundreds, now managed with a few loyal servants. Meals were simple. Walks were restricted. Letters were censored. The telephone no longer rang. Yet even in this strange new captivity, the family tried to maintain their old rhythm, as if by habit alone, they could stitch together the world that was slipping from their hands. Nicholas kept to his routine. He chopped wood in the garden, strolled with the children, and wrote in his diary each night with a neat, deliberate hand. Alexandra, more fragile now, remained in her wheelchair for much of the day, her health worsened by anxiety and grief. She wrote letters by the dozens, to her family abroad, to loyalists still whispering hope in exile, and always, always to pray. The children, Olda, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, lived a strange half-life. No longer royal, yet not quite ordinary. They played games, read books aloud, embroidered, studied languages. Alexei, his health as delicate as ever, found comfort in his sister's laughter, in the routine that softened the fear. But even as they smiled, even as they laughed at old family jokes or watched the garden turn from frost to thaw, the world outside grew darker. The provisional government in Petrograd was fragile, pulled between liberals, socialists, soldiers, and workers. Power was shifting too quickly, too violently. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, newly returned from exile, were gaining ground. The war still raged. Food still ran short. And the people, still hungry, began to look toward justice. Revenge. In whispers, in pamphlets, in street corner speeches, the name Romanov began to curdle in the public mind. Not as individuals, not as mother, father, children, but as symbols of inequality, of cruelty, of everything that had gone wrong. The government debated what to do with the former Tsar, with his German-born wife, with the boy, with the daughters. Some proposed the trial, others exile. A few hoped a foreign cousin, perhaps King George in England, might offer them sanctuary. But diplomacy moves slower than revolution. And meanwhile, the Romanovs waited. They tended their garden. They knelt for evening prayers. They wrote in their journals, the girls often with affection, a touch of boredom, and increasing sorrow. They took photographs with the guards, who sometimes softened, sometimes sneered. Outside their walls, the world was being rewritten. And so, dear dreamer, the days grew long in Tsarskoye Selo. The sun hung low. And the once royal family remained suspended, not yet condemned, but no longer free. Waiting. Always waiting. And so, as the leaves began to fall from the trees, another carriage prepared to carry them further from the center, and closer to the end. In August 1917, the Romanovs were told to pack. Not too much, just essentials. No trunks of gowns, no jewels. Just clothing, books, and a few keepsakes. There would be no court, no ceremony, no farewell procession. Only a train, and a destination whispered like a sentence, Tobolsk. Tobolsk, a remote town in western Siberia, perched along the banks of the Irtysh River, where the wind howled over wooden rooftops and winter could last more than half a year. It had once been the seat of exile for criminals and poets. Now, it would house the fallen monarchs. Their journey began under a grey sky. The train rolled out of Tsarskoye Selo in silence. No crowds, no tears. Only a few guards, a few servants, and the heavy hush of exile. For Nicholas, it was a strange return to his childhood dreams. He had always loved the Russian countryside, the simplicity of rural life. For a moment, he imagined this might be a kind of peace, that they could settle, live quietly, perhaps even be forgotten. Alexandra, frilier than ever, clutched her children close. Her health, long precarious, worsened with the journey. She leaned on her daughters, on faith, on whatever strength remained. The children, they watched. Alexei, wrapped in layers, endured the trip with silent courage, his joints stiff, his blood always threatening to betray him. The girls, bright, sensitive, tender, helped the guides with meals, tended to their mother, sang softly in the evenings. When they arrived, Tobolsk greeted them not with torches, but with curiosity. The house prepared for them, a former governor's mansion, was modest, drafty, with low ceilings and icy windows. But it was clean, solid, safer than most had hoped. And so, once again, the Romanovs began to build a life from scraps. They carried their habits with them like sacred relics. Morning tea, family prayers, lessons in French and English, card games, sketching, sewing. Nicholas cut firewood daily, his boots crunching over snow. Tatiana organized household duties like a governess. Olga read aloud from Tolstoy. Anastasia played tricks on the guards. Maria sang. They even built a small chapel from 2 rooms in the house, a place to kneel, to light candles, to remember a life that now seemed impossibly far away. Outside, the revolution continued its spiral. In Petrograd, the provisional government faltered. The Bolsheviks, sharper and more ruthless, were gaining ground. Lenin's red tide was rising. Still, in Tobolsk, there was a strange pause. A moment of stillness. Of waiting. For a few months, the family was left alone. The guides were firm but respectful. The snow muffled the world beyond. And Nicholas, now simply Citizen Romanov, felt, perhaps, a flicker of hope. That this might be their end, not death, but quiet. A life out of history's spotlight. Together. Alive. But history, dear dreamer, does not forgive symbols so easily. And when the Bolsheviks seized power that autumn, the pause ended. A message came. The family would move again, this time, to a harsher place. And not all at once. Alexandra and 1 daughter would accompany Alexei. Nicholas and the others would follow. The path ahead grew darker, colder. And so, as the snow began to fall heavier upon the roof of their Siberian exile, another door opened, one that would lead them deeper into the heart of Russia, and toward a city that no longer bore its name. The train ride to Ekaterinburg was not marked by ceremony, but by silence. In April 1918, Alexandra, Alexei, and Maria were taken first. The boy, too weak to travel easily, was cradled gently by his mother, his pale face tucked in blankets. A week later, Nicholas, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia followed. The family, long accustomed to separations, held their breath until they were reunited in this new place. This cold house with thick red walls and tightly drawn curtains. They called it the House of Special Purpose. Once the home of a local engineer named Ipadev, it was now something else entirely. A prison draped in domestic disguise. Windows were painted over. Curtains nailed shut. Guards stationed at every door. The family was forbidden to leave the property. Even in the garden, they were watched like birds in a cage. Still, they tried to live, or pretend to. Nicholas tended to Alexei, whose condition had worsened with the strain of travel. The boy now spent much of his time on a wheelchair or in bed, his joints too swollen to move without pain. Alexander sat beside him daily, brushing his hair, whispering prayers. The daughters continued their quiet rituals. Tatiana kept the household order. Olga drifted into melancholy, often reading or gazing out the painted windows. Maria tried to soothe the guides with small talk and warm eyes. And Anastasia, still spirited, still mischievous, played with her dog and mimicked accents to make her sisters smile. But the guards had changed. These were not the half-sympathetic men of Tobolsk. In Ekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks rolled with clenched fists and sharpened words. The Ural Soviet, staunchly anti-monarchist, viewed the Romanovs not as people but as relics to be erased. They were referred to coldly. Citizen Romanov, the woman Romanova, the boy. Outside the house, the city buzzed with uncertainty. civil war raged across Russia. The Red Army and the White Army clashed in bloody confusion. The Romanovs had become pawns on a crumbling chessboard, each side debating their worth. Would they be rescued? There were rumors. The Whites were advancing. The Germans, perhaps, would intervene. Monarchists in hiding passed notes, forged plans, whispered of daring escapes. But inside the House of Special Purpose, time slowed. Nicholas wrote in his journal, though the entries had grown sparse. Meals arrived at odd hours. The guards rotated frequently. Rules changed daily. And then, the piano stopped. Tatiana, once permitted to play softly in the evenings, was told to stop. All comforts vanished. The radio was removed. The ICAM corner dismantled. Typewriters confiscated. Conversation with the guards forbidden. The silence became unbearable. Alexandra confided in her daughters that their fate was no longer in God's hands, but in history's. The girls, still so young, still filled with flickers of light, wept quietly and held one another through the long Siberian nights. Outside, summer came to Ekaterinburg. But within the house, the walls pressed in. The air thickened. The mood turned. They did not know it, dear dreamer, but they were nearing the end. The final room had been prepared. The final words rehearsed. And so, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, another night began, the last the Romanovs would ever see. It was July 16th, 1918. The evening passed like many others in the House of Special Purpose, quietly, with fatigue layered over fear. The Romanovs had grown used to routine even in captivity. Dinner was taken as usual, simple and sparse. The family gathered in the drawing room afterward. Alexei was too weak to move far, so he lay on a small couch, his legs stiff and swaddled. Nicholas read aloud from a book, his voice steady, unhurried. Alexandra embroidered, her needle rising and falling like breath. The girls sat together, Tatiana helping Olga plait her hair, Maria sketching in the corner, Anastasia whispering jokes beneath her breath. Outside, a warm breeze stirred the summer trees. But the windows remained sealed, the curtains shut tight. The guards, restless and sharp-eyed, paced the halls in shifts. Something was different. Something was coming. At around midnight, a knock on the door. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, stood grim and pale. He told Nicholas to dress his family. There had been unrest in the city, he claimed. It was too dangerous for them to remain upstairs. They would be moved to a safer location. The family obeyed without protest. Nicholas woke Alexei, cradled him carefully in his arms. The girls dressed quickly, some hiding jewels beneath their clothes, small treasures sewn into bodices and hems, just in case. A habit from exile. A hope of survival. They descended the narrow staircase in silence. Down to the cellar. The room was small, dimly lit, bare. A few chairs had been brought in. Alexandra sat. Nicholas held Alexei on his lap. The girls lined up behind their parents, still in nightclothes, still blinking from sleep. They waited. Then came the footsteps. Yurovsky returned, flanked by armed men. He looked not at the family, but at a piece of paper in his hands. Then he spoke, not gently, not slowly. "Nikolai Alexandrovich," he said, "in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." Nicholas, startled, turned toward his family. "What?" he asked. Yurovsky repeated the order. Nicholas tried to speak, but the sound was drowned in the deafening burst of gunfire. The execution was not swift. Nicholas died first, shot at close range. Alexander next, slumped where she sat. The girls, protected by the diamonds beneath their clothes, did not fall immediately. Bullets ricocheted. Cries rose. The air filled with smoke, blood, screams. They were stabbed, shot again, until no one moved. Alexei, still clinging to his father and death, lingered longest. A boy of 13. A child born to rule an empire that no longer existed. When it was over, silence returned. Heavy. Absolute. The bodies were stripped, looted. The jewels sewn into the girls' corsets had to be cut free. The corpses were loaded into a truck, driven into the woods outside the city. There, in the hush of dawn, they were buried. No monument. No hymns. Only the soil, the trees, the shadows. And yet, they did not vanish. Their story remained, in diaries, in letters, in faded photographs. In lullabies once sung in palace nurseries. In prayers whispered by candlelight. A family, not just a dynasty. Human aching lost. And so, dear dreamer, as we close this chapter, not with vengeance, but with sorrow, we leave behind not just the fall of a house, but the hush of a world that once believed in crowns. And so ends the Romanovs. But another part of their story waits, in remembrance, in legacy, in the silence that followed. The news did not spread quickly. There was no grand announcement, no funeral, no black-draped procession through the snow. Only silence at first, and then rumors. Whispers in train stations. A headline buried in the back of a newspaper. The former Tsar is dead. No mention of the Empress. No mention of the children. No mention of bullets, of blood, of the cellar that now held ghosts. In Petrograd and Moscow, the Bolsheviks celebrated quietly, cautiously. They feared public reaction. They feared martyrdom. But to the Soviet leadership, the deed was done. The past had been erased in a single night. Yet the world outside Russia stirred with unease. In Europe, royal cousins reeled. King George V of England, who had once called Nicholas Nicky, was haunted by guilt. He had hesitated months earlier when asked to offer the Romanovs refuge. Political pressure, public opinion, they had all played their part in his refusal. Now, he read the cable and knew the truth too late. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, Alexander's cousin, was similarly shaken. He had once admired the Russian court, had sent telegrams and coded affection. Now, he stared at the fall of a dynasty with something close to dread. But it was in Russia, dear dreamer, where the loss cut deepest, though not immediately, and not for everyone. For some, the Romanovs had been figures of tyranny, symbols of inequality, of centuries of serfdom and silence. Their fall was seen as justice, inevitable, necessary. But for others, especially in the countryside, the sorrow took root quietly, like frost. Peasants who had once lined the roads to glimpse the Tsar's carriage now left icons of the imperial family at church altars. Mothers who had never seen a palace wept for the girls, for Olga, for Maria, for the little one, Anastasia. They were still children, and children do not choose crowns. In time, the truth began to surface. The details of the execution, at first hidden, were leaked by those who had been there. Survivors. Witnesses. The bones, long buried in secrecy, would one day rise from the earth, but not yet. In the years that followed, the Romanov story fractured. There were imposters, women claiming to be Anastasia, rescued by miracle. Men swearing to be Alexei, grown in exile. They found believers, sponsors, even courts. But none were true. Their lives became sad epilogues, desperate echoes of a tale that had already ended. The new Soviet regime pushed forward, into war, into famine, into transformation. Lenin died. Stalin rose. Palaces were looted. Churches burned. And the old world, the world of tsars and silk and winter roses, was buried deeper beneath the red tide of history. Yet memory endures. In exile, Romanov relatives scattered across Europe, to Paris, to London, to the Balkans. Some lived in obscurity. Others became quiet chroniclers, keepers of flame. Their stories, like embers, survived in journals, in heirlooms, in lullabies sung in borrowed tongues. And somewhere, always, the question remained. Could it have been different? If Nicholas had abdicated sooner, if Alexander had not trusted Rasputin, if the war had ended before it began, if mercy had found them in the final hour. But history does not trade in if, only in was. And so, dear dreamer, we drift now through the ashes of empire. The house is silent. The snow has fallen, and the ghosts walk gently, unseen, where once they danced beneath chandeliers. The woods outside Ekaterinburg held their silence well. For decades, the place where the Romanovs had been buried remained unmarked. The Soviets, fearful of turning the family into martyrs, went to great lengths to erase their final resting place. The bodies had been burned, doused with acid, buried, moved, scattered. The burial site, a muddy forest clearing called Koptyaki, was guarded not with fences, but with fear. And yet, the truth was never fully buried. In secret, whispers passed from lips to lips, guides who had been there, peasants who saw strange bonfires in the night, loose tongues softened by vodka and time. Somewhere, just beyond the tree line, the Tsar and his family lay beneath the soil. But it would be many years, long after the Soviet Union had hardened into steel, before anyone dared to look for them. It wasn't until the 1970s that a quiet man named Alexander Avinin, an amateur historian and geologist, began his quiet search. He pored over testimonies, maps, secret documents, rumors passed down like myths. His partner, filmmaker Jelly Ryabov, helped gather the threads. And in 1979, they found it. The shallow grave. Bones. Rusted bullets. Fragments of clothing. A buckle. A boot. Evidence. Quiet, weathered, undeniable. But they told no one. It was too dangerous. The Soviet government still maintained its silence. To speak of the Romanovs' final resting place was to court suspicion, arrest, exile. And so, they waited. Photographed. Catalogued. Covered it all again with earth. Only in 1989, as the Soviet Union began to fracture, did they finally reveal the site. And then, the world turned its eyes to the forest. Forensic scientists arrived. Bones were exhumed. Teeth matched. Skull fragments were scanned. DNA tested against living Romanov relatives, most notably Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, a great-nephew of Alexandra. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the family. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia. But two were missing. Maria and Alexei. Or was it Anastasia and Alexei? The debate flared. Conspiracy bloomed again. Had someone escaped? Had one of the girls survived? Years passed. And then, in 2007, another grave was found, just yards from the first. Two bodies. Smaller. Damaged. But the DNA confirmed it. Alexei and one sister. Likely Maria. The family was whole. After nearly a century, the remains of the Romanovs, scattered, hidden, desecrated, had returned to the light. In 1998, 80 years after their execution, Nicholas, Alexandra, and three of their daughters were laid to rest in St. Petersburg and the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. A royal funeral. Bells tolled. Candles burned. The Russian flag draped the coffins. President Boris Yeltsin attended. So did members of the Romanov family. And the church sang softly, as though history itself had paused to listen. Alexei and the missing daughter, though identified, still await formal burial, caught, once again, in political delay. For in modern Russia, the Romanovs remain a delicate symbol. Saints to some, cautionary ghosts to others. Yet their bones lie quiet now. And with them, perhaps, the final echo of an age. It began not with royal decree, but with candles. In the years following the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia rediscovered a hunger for memory. Churches reopened. Icons were restored. And in quiet corners of the country, people lit candles before old photographs, not just of saints, but of the Romanovs. To some, they were martyrs. Not for their politics, not for their privilege, but for their suffering. For the silent way they met their fate. For the dignity in that final descent into shadow. In 1981, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, an emigre church formed by monarchists in exile, canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children as passion bearers. It was a delicate designation, one that honored their humility and suffering rather than miracle or divine act. The faithful prayed before their images. Churches were named in their honor, and in some small homes, next to statues of Christ and the Virgin, There sat a simple frame with 5 young faces: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. Children frozen in time, crowned not with gold, but with grief. Inside Russia, the conversation was more hesitant. The Russian Orthodox Church, long entwined with the state, approached the matter slowly. After all, the Romanovs were not universally beloved. Nicholas's role had ended in chaos. Alexandra's legacy remained clouded by Rasputin's shadow, and many feared turning them into saints would be seen not as reverence, but revision. But the people, they kept praying. At last, in the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the entire family. Not as martyrs of faith, but as passion bearers, those who met their deaths with Christian humility. The ceremony was held with solemn grandeur. Bells rang across the land. Their icons were painted in soft gold. Candles flickered in the cathedral where their remains had been buried just 2 years prior. Yet not everyone rejoiced. Some critics argued the canonization blurred history with myth. That sainthood was not the answer to political failure. That the Romanovs, whatever their virtues, had ruled during pogroms, during famine, during brutal wars. Their deaths were tragic, but were they truly holy? Others asked what it meant for modern Russia to canonize a royal family while poverty persisted, while new wounds opened across the nation. Was it healing? Or nostalgia? And still, the faithful came. They made pilgrimages to Ekaterinburg, to the site of the Ipatiev house, now replaced by a cathedral, the Church on the Blood. Inside, icons of the Romanovs shimmer beneath candlelight. Visitors pray quietly before the royal faces. Some cry. Some cross themselves. Some whisper names like old friends. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei. A family reborn in memory, not myth. And so, dear dreamer, in the soft glow of devotion and debate, the Romanovs live again, not as rulers, not as saints for all, but as a story still unfolding in the hush of midnight vigils. Time has passed, but their faces remain. Nicholas, with his neat beard and sad eyes. Alexandra, serene, pale, always clutching the invisible weight of worry. Olga, the thoughtful one. Tatiana, dignified and strong. Maria, soft-eyed and kind. Anastasia, the spark. And Alexei, the fragile boy who bore the burden of a crumbling crown. They no longer reign, but in memory they are everywhere. In modern Russia, the Romanovs walk a strange path, both honored and debated, saints to some, symbols of warning to others. Their story is taught in classrooms, written in books, etched into documentaries and dramas. Statues have risen. Streets have been renamed. Films cast actors with delicate features and tragic eyes. And yet, the legacy remains complex. For the Romanovs represent more than just a lost dynasty. They represent the end of an era, and perhaps, the human cost of it. To monarchists and traditionalists, Nicholas is remembered with tenderness. A gentle man, too kind for his throne. Alexandra, too, misunderstood, overwhelmed by grief and illness, a foreigner who never quite belonged. To them, the family is sacred, not perfect, but persecuted. Symbols of faith crushed by a godless age. To others, they are relics of inequality. Proof that divinity does not dwell in palaces. That no crown is earned by bloodline alone. That the empire they led was deeply flawed, its vast wealth bought at the cost of millions who had none. And yet, dear dreamer, something curious happened in the century that followed their deaths. The world began to see them not only as rulers, but as people. The flood of photographs, once private, became public. In them we see not sovereigns, but a family, Nicholas playing tennis with his daughters, Tatiana feeding chickens, Anastasia making faces for the camera, Maria holding a kitten, Alexandra braiding Olga's hair, Alexei, fragile and smiling, leaning on his sister's shoulder. These moments, delicate as moth wings, invite not judgment, but compassion. In a world addicted to noise, the Romanovs whisper. Their tragedy slows us down, reminds us of how quickly thrones turn to coffins, how even golden halls cannot shield us from fate. Each year, on July 17th, the anniversary of their execution, pilgrims walk through Ekaterinburg in silent procession. They carry candles. Some wear black. Others carry flowers. They retrace the Romanovs' final steps from the train station to the forest, from the house to the grave, from history to memory. And every so often, dear dreamer, someone leaves a letter. A note tucked at the base of a statue. A message scribbled on a church wall. Not as a subject to a sovereign, but as one soul to another. I'm sorry. I remember. You are not forgotten. And so the Romanovs live, not in palaces, but in the quiet corners of remembrance. In lullabies. In chapel light. In the hearts of those who still light candles for the children lost. He was born to rule, but never desired to reign. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov came into the world in May of 1868, in the opulent palace of Tsarskoye Selo, swaddled in velvet and ancient expectation. As the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, he was destined from his first breath to become the emperor of all the Russias. But destiny, as we know, dear dreamer, does not ask permission. From the outside, Nicholas was the picture of a monarch in waiting. Dignified, polite, beautifully dressed. He spoke multiple languages and was taught the proper stiffness of diplomacy. But within, he carried a quiet, almost aching gentleness. His education was rigorous, but it did not prepare him for rule. His father, the iron-willed Alexander III, believed in the weight of autocracy, that a ruler must be unyielding, unquestioned, almost divine. Nicholas admired him deeply, even feared him a little. And so, he learned how to imitate command, but never how to question it. He was close to his mother, Empress Maria Fyodorovna, a Danish princess full of elegance and wit. But it was not her politics that stayed with him. It was her warmth, her letters, her love of family. And that, dear dreamer, was Nicholas's defining trait, his love. He adored his wife, Alexandra, with a devotion that stunned even his advisors. Their letters are a treasure chest of tenderness, filled with pet names, doodles, confessions. To him, she was not just empress, but beloved. Sunny, he called her, his compass in the dark. And their children, he loved them more than he ever loved power. Every morning, he took walks with his daughters. He played games, told stories, carved toys by hand. With Alexei, he was patient and protective, a father trying to outrun a curse. In photographs, Nicholas often looks not like a ruler, but like a man momentarily distracted from duty, leaning in, listening, smiling with eyes that seemed to search for peace. But peace was not the world he inherited. Nicholas became Tsar in 1894, after the sudden death of his father. He was only 26. Shy, ill-prepared. In his first address, he admitted as much, that he felt unfit, unsure. But autocracy allowed no pause. And so, he sat on the throne of an empire that stretched from Poland to the Pacific, and did what he had always done. He followed tradition. He clung to autocracy, not out of cruelty, but from fear. He believed deeply that to loosen his grip would be to let chaos in. He distrusted reformers, feared change. He ruled not as a visionary, but as a guardian of an inheritance he barely understood. And in his caution, the world moved past him. Industrial unrest, political turmoil, the revolution of 1905, the rise of Marxist ideology. He watched these things unfold with increasing confusion, retreating more and more into his family, into the warm, safe cocoon of his children's laughter. He was not a villain, but he was not a leader for his time. He was a man who wanted peace, but brought war. A father who loved deeply, but failed to protect. A ruler who tried to preserve a world that no longer existed. And in the end, dear dreamer, Nicholas II was not overthrown by hatred, but by history, by a tide too strong for one gentle heart to resist. He died with his family, not as a Tsar, but as a husband, a father, and a man whose only true crime was being crowned in a century that had no more use for crowns. She was born a princess, but never quite belonged. Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, came into the world not with trumpets, but with grief waiting around every corner. She was raised in the prim, Protestant world of the German nobility, a world of black dresses, restrained manners, and carefully folded handkerchiefs. But death came early to her door. Her mother, Princess Alice, died when Alex was still a child, and the shadows of that loss followed her through every drawing room, every chapel, every diary page. She grew into a striking young woman, slender, intelligent, with storm gray eyes and a soul that seemed always half turned towards something distant. She read deeply, felt deeply, believed deeply, and above all, she longed for love, not flattery, not flings, but the kind of devotion that could anchor a soul adrift. She found that in Nicholas. Their love was not arranged. It was not strategic. It was rare. He saw her not as a pawn, but as a partner. She, in turn, saw him not as a czar, but as a man of quiet strength and gentle habits. Against the objections of courts and cousins, they married. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna, and walked into a world that never fully opened its arms to her. Russia was colder than Germany, not just in climate, but in custom. The court in St. Petersburg was dazzling, but ruthless. The nobility whispered. Her accent mocked her. Her reserve, born of shyness and pain, was mistaken for pride. Where others laughed, she prayed. Where others mingled, she withdrew. But she found her joy in the small circle of her family. She bore 4 daughters in quick succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. Each birth was met with adoration and quiet disappointment. Russia needed a son. The throne needed a male heir. Alexandra bore the weight of this expectation like a stone in her pocket, invisible, but constant. And finally, in 1904, her prayer was answered. A son, Alexei. But joy turned to dread. The boy bruised easily. He bled without stopping. Hemophilia, that ancient royal curse, had found its way into the Russian bloodline. Alexandra blamed herself. She carried the gene unknowingly, inherited from her own grandmother, Queen Victoria. And now her beloved child, the boy she had waited years for, was as fragile as porcelain. She became obsessed with his health. Withdrawn. Desperate. And it was desperation, dear dreamer, that opened the door to Rasputin. To her, he was not a scandal. He was a miracle. A man who could ease her son's pain when no one else could. And for that, she would trust him with anything, even the empire. This was her great tragedy. She ruled in Nicholas's absence not from ambition, but from terror, fear of losing her son, her husband, her world. Her letters from this time are filled not with orders, but with pleading. She saw revolution as a storm to be prayed away, not understood. She believed loyalty would endure. She did not see how far the cracks had already spread. By the time they were imprisoned, Alexandra's health was failing. Her back ached constantly. Her legs swelled. Her nerves frayed. Yet she remained composed, dignified. She knelt beside her son. She whispered bedtime prayers. She braided her daughter's hair by candlelight. She faced exile with quiet resignation. And in the final days, in that last cellar room, she reached for Nicholas's hand and held it. She died not as a foreign empress, but as a mother who had tried to protect her child. To history, Alexandra remains a puzzle, cold, tragic, misguided. But to those who read her letters, who trace the curve of her sorrow, she becomes something far simpler. A woman, a wife, a mother with a heart too heavy for the crown she wore. In the photographs, they often stand side by side. Olga, the firstborn, her expression serious, eyes like storm clouds. Tatiana, just a year younger, composed and elegant, the most poised of them all. They were known as the Big Pair, a nickname that came not only from their closeness in age, but from the roles they instinctively stepped into. From an early age, they understood that they were not just daughters, but daughters of a czar. There was ceremony in everything: how they walked, how they curtsied, how they spoke, how they smiled. But beneath the training, there was heart. And in both girls, it beat strong, if differently. Olga Nikolaevna, born in 1895, was intelligent and introspective. She read widely, wrote poetry, thought deeply. Of all the sisters, she felt the weight of their fate earliest, a kind of sorrow that flickered behind her gaze even in childhood. She was blunt in speech, fiery in temper, and often found comfort in solitude, scribbling in notebooks, lost in thought. When the revolution came, she would write long entries trying to understand the world turning against her. Tatiana, born in 1897, was her mother's shadow. Dignified, dutiful, precise. She organized, planned, maintained calm. The nurses at the Imperial Hospital during the war called her the governess, because she managed things so efficiently. She was less emotional than Olga, more reserved, but her sense of loyalty to family, to faith, to Russia was unwavering. During World War I, both girls trained as nurses alongside their mother. They washed wounds, wrapped bandages, sat beside broken men groaning in pain. Not in silks, but in aprons, their sleeves rolled up. It was here, perhaps, that they were most free, not as grand duchesses, but as human beings. Their letters from this time are full of longing, confusion, a touch of romance, and an aching maturity. When the monarchy fell and the family was placed under house arrest, it was Olga and Tatiana who shouldered the emotional labor. They held their siblings together. They took over household chores. They guarded their mother's fragile nerves and tried to keep the younger girls, Maria and Anastasia, distracted from fear. Olga, increasingly melancholy, wrote a feeling like a soul adrift. She knew what was coming, even if no one said it aloud. She became quieter, more distant. She prayed often and read books about faith and sacrifice. Tatiana stayed strong, outwardly unshaken, a pillar for her siblings. She consoled the gods, sewed clothes, kept calm even when everything around her was unraveling. In their final months, the two girls continued to journal. They spoke of dreams, of homes they would never build, of lives they would never live. They were not queens. They were not rebels. They were young women standing on the edge of the world, holding hands in the dark. And when the end came, they did not beg or scream. They stood beside their parents, protecting, waiting. And in the echo of gunfire, they fell, not as symbols of monarchy, but as daughters trying to keep their family whole until the very last breath. They were the little pair, the younger Romanov sisters, always together, always somehow one heartbeat behind the others. If Olga and Tatiana were duty and dignity, Maria and Anastasia were joy and mischief, the breath of warmth that floated through the cold formality of imperial life. Maria Nikolaevna, born in 1899, was the third daughter, often overlooked by courtiers who focused on her older sister's elegance or her younger sister's wild charm. But to those who knew her, she glowed. Soft-voiced and open-hearted, Maria was the peacemaker among the siblings. She had wide blue eyes and a round, gentle face. Her nurses called her Mashka. Her family called her their angel. She loved painting, singing, and writing affectionate letters, sometimes to soldiers, sometimes to family friends, sometimes to boys she met in the palace hospital during the war. Her heart was open, sometimes too open. She longed for a home, a husband, a life beyond the court. Once, she whispered to a maid, "I want to get married, have 20 children." She was the one who lingered longest with wounded soldiers, who held their hands, asked about their mothers. And then there was Anastasia. Anastasia Nikolaevna, born in 1901, the youngest daughter, the firebrand, the spark. She was the mischief of the Romanov household, the irreverent voice in a world obsessed with decorum. She made faces in portraits. She imitated tutors behind their backs. She played pranks on the maids, the guards, even her father. She could charm or annoy, depending on the hour, but always with the kind of bright spirit that refuses to be dimmed. She had a sharp tongue and a laugh that echoed through the palace walls. She hated embroidery, hated long speeches. She preferred climbing trees to curtsying. Her letters are full of jokes, little sketches, sarcastic commentary on the world around her. But beneath the mischief was a child with a deep capacity for love. She doted on her brother Alexei, often comforting him when pain overwhelmed his small body. She teased him, yes, but never cruelly. They were closest in age and shared a language of play and tenderness. In exile, she was often the one to lift his spirits. As the family's situation worsened, both Maria and Anastasia held tight to one another. In Tobolsk, they organized games for the guards and tried to bring joy to their increasingly gray existence. In Ekaterinburg, they clung to each other like lifeboats. It's said that even in the house of special purpose, Anastasia made the guards laugh. But no laughter could save them. On that final night, Maria and Anastasia were among the last to die. The jewels sewn into their bodices, meant to protect them in escape, instead shielded them from bullets. They suffered longer. They cried out for each other in the dark. They were only 19 and 17. And so, dear dreamer, their light was extinguished, not in silence, but in a storm of violence undeserved. Yet their laughter lingers, if you listen closely. In the leaves rustling outside old palaces. In the gentle creak of a swing. In a name scribbled on a faded diary page. Nastia. They were never queens. Never wives. Never given the years to grow. But they were loved. And they are remembered. It stood at the corner of Voznesensky Prospect and Kolpatovsky Lane, a simple two-story house, pale-walled and modest, with nothing to mark it as extraordinary. But history, dear dreamer, often hides in the plainest places. The Ipativ house, named after its last owner, engineer Nikolai Ipativ, was seized by the Bolsheviks in the spring of 1918 and quickly repurposed. They called it the House of Special Purpose. Not a prison, not a palace. Something between. Its rooms were stripped of luxury. Rugs replaced with cold floors. Portraits with barbed whispers. The windows, painted white, let in no light. Curtains nailed shut. And each step through the halls was shadowed by the gaze of armed guards who were told not to smile, not to speak, not to soften. The Romanovs entered it as a family. They would not leave as one. In those final months, the house held silence like breath. Each day was like the last. Tea. Walks around the small, walled garden. Reading. Praying. Watching the sunlight change through painted glass. It was, by design, a place of waiting. And then came the final night, July 16th into 17th. A cellar. A burst of violence that tore the air apart. And when it was over, the house stood quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The bodies were removed. The blood scrubbed from the floorboards. The furniture rearranged. The evidence hidden. But the house remembered. For years, it remained in use. Briefly by officials, quietly by caretakers. But it became harder to ignore. Pilgrims began to arrive, whispering prayers at the corners of its walls. Local people claimed they heard cries at night, saw shadows at the windows, felt an unnatural stillness as they passed. By the 1970s, the Soviet government had grown uneasy. They feared what the house might become, a shrine, a symbol, a rallying point. And so in 1977, under orders from the highest levels, the Ipativ house was demolished. Not preserved. Erased. But memory is not so easily broken. Even after the bulldozers cleared the ground, the site remained sacred to many. Locals planted flowers. Visitors still came. They stood on the pavement, unsure where to look, unsure what to say. Only silence, and the weight of what had been, remained. Then, after the fall of the Soviet Union, everything changed. In the 1990s, with the Romanovs canonized and their remains returned, a decision was made to build not over the past, but in its honor. In 2003, the church on the blood was consecrated, a soaring, golden-domed cathedral built directly over the site of the Ipativ house. It is beautiful. It is solemn. And in its icons, you will see their faces. Nicholas. Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei. Inside, candles are always burning. Pilgrims bow, cross themselves, whisper the Jesus prayer. On the walls are photographs, grainy, silent witnesses to the end of a family and an empire. Outside, birch trees sway gently. Bells chime in the breeze. The house is gone. But what happened there will never be. Not every grave is made of stone. Some are built of footsteps, prayers, and silence. And in the case of the Romanovs, their journey to rest was not simple, not swift, and not sealed with the rites of kings. When the Romanovs were murdered in July 1918, their remains were hidden. Burned, buried, moved, scattered. It would be over 70 years before they were unearthed again, quietly, carefully, by historians and scientists brave enough to look beneath the snow and silence. In 1998, 80 years after their deaths, 5 of the 7 were given a proper burial. Nicholas II, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia. They were laid to rest with solemn dignity in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of Russia's Tsars. This city where Nicholas had once reigned. This city where the empire had begun and ended. On July 17th of that year, their coffins, understated pale wood, were carried into the cathedral one by one. Not in a gilded procession, but in a company of mourners who carry not banners, but tears. President Boris Yeltsin spoke that day, his voice quiet. He called the murder a shame upon Russia. A warning, too, of what happens when power loses its humanity. He bowed his head. And then, the bells tolled. Inside the cathedral, the Romanovs were placed in a special side chapel, their own family tomb. The space is simple. Soft gold. Candles flicker beneath the icons. Their names are carved into white marble. A small cross stands before each sarcophagus. And every day, dear dreamer, people come. Some with flowers. Some with only silence. They kneel. They whisper. They reach out and touch the cold stone as if to say, I remember you. Not for your throne. Not for your title. But for your love. Your tragedy. Your unbearable end. But not all the family lies there. Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Maria, were not buried in 1998. Their remains were discovered later, confirmed by DNA, but their journey into rest has been delayed by politics and ecclesiastical debate. To this day, they wait in a government archive, their small bones in quiet boxes, guarded not by marble angels, but by paperwork and hesitation. Still, the people remember them too. Each July 17th, thousands gather in Ekaterinburg for a midnight liturgy at the church on the blood. Then they walk. For hours. In candlelight and silence. They follow the path from the cathedral to the woods of Gonina Yama, where the bodies were first discarded. It is a pilgrimage not of triumph, but of mourning. At Gonina Yama, there are 7 small chapels now, one for each family member. The air is thick with incense and pine. Bells ring softly among the trees. Icons hang from the branches. The faithful bow before images of children in tiaras, saints in peasant robes. And even the unbelievers, even those who come only out of curiosity, find themselves stilled by something they can name. A hush. A heaviness. A holiness. Not for what the Romanovs ruled, but for what they lost. And so, dear dreamer, the graves of the Romanovs stretch not only across cities, but across the hearts of all who have stood before them, candle in hand, and whispered, you are still remembered. Nicholas II of Russia and George V of Britain were not just fellow monarchs. They were close, so close, in fact, that they looked like brothers. In portraits, it is difficult to tell them apart, both with neatly trimmed beards, both with the quiet posture of men raised not to rule by choice, but by inheritance. Their grandmother was the same formidable figure, Queen Victoria, the empress of half the known world. She was Alexander's grandmother as well, making the Romanovs deeply entwined with British royalty. And so, dear dreamer, in a world that still believed in bloodlines and diplomacy, it was almost unthinkable that Britain would not come to their aid. But the world was changing. When revolution erupted in Russia in 1917, the provisional government, still unsure of how to manage the imperial family, quietly reached out to its allies. Would Britain offer them sanctuary? For a brief, flickering moment, the answer was yes. George V and his advisors considered it seriously. After all, Nicholas was his cousin, affectionately known as Nicky. Alexander was family too, if a more difficult figure in British eyes. Surely, the crown would extend its hand. Surely, blood was thicker than revolution. But as the days passed, the answer changed. Britain was not as stable as its polished surfaces suggested. The Great War had drained it. The people were tired, hungry. Watching the Romanovs, symbols of unchecked autocracy, arrive in London might have sparked protests, even rebellion. The government worried. The public mood was shifting, and George V, under pressure, withdrew the offer. He later claimed he had no choice, that his hands were tied by ministers and circumstance. But the effect was the same. No British ship came to Russian shores. No train pulled into Petrograd. The Romanovs remained, unguarded, unsupported, increasingly isolated. Nicholas never publicly blamed his cousin, but those close to him saw the wound. In exile, he reread old letters. He still called Georgie, with a kind of weary affection. But the hope that Britain might save them slowly died. In later years, George V was said to be haunted by his decision. He spoke little of it, but his silence was telling. After the war, he supported distant Romanov relatives in exile, offering pensions, arranging quiet housing. He even helped sponsor the education of some survivors. But for Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children, it was too late. Their ship never came. And so, dear dreamer, history reminds us that crowns do not always protect, not even from one another. That thrones, no matter how gilded, cannot always bridge oceans. And that sometimes, even the most powerful families must watch their own vanish into the silence of history. 2 cousins, 2 kings. One lived, one died. And between them, a regret that still echoes like fog across the channel. She was the one who would not stay dead. In the aftermath of the Romanov murders, as the blood dried and the whispers thickened, one rumor rose above all others, a tale so persistent, so heartbreaking, that it survived nearly a century, that the youngest daughter, Anastasia Nikolaevna, had escaped. The world needed to believe it, because the truth, that a 17-year-old girl with quicksilver wit and bright blue eyes had died in a hail of bullets in a basement, was too cruel to accept. And because Anastasia was not just a name, she was the last flicker of a vanished world. The rumors began almost immediately. Witnesses in Ekaterinburg spoke of a girl seen limping from the woods, of a body missing from the grave, of guards who hesitated, of fate, that old magician, working a last-minute miracle. Then, in 1920, the whispers took form. A woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin, half-drowned, dazed, silent. She gave no name. She bore strange scars. She refused to speak for weeks. But when she did, the story changed forever. She claimed, in time, to be Anastasia Romanova. She said she had been rescued by a compassionate guard, hidden, smuggled west. She said she remembered the cellar, remembered her sisters dying, remembered being carried away in the dark. Her name, or at least the one she eventually gave, was Anna Anderson. And the world, weary of war, desperate for romance, listened. Some believed her instantly. Others doubted. But many clung to the possibility that one branch of the Romanov tree had survived. That not everything had been lost in that July night. The press swarmed. Royalists rallied. Investigators examined her face, her hands, her memories. Did she recognize servants? Could she speak Russian? Did her foot match the childhood injury Anastasia had once sustained? The answers were never quite clear. But they were enough for some. She spent years drifting from country to country. Court cases followed, some to determine her identity, others to access the Romanov inheritance. She lived in convents, in apartments, sometimes in luxury, sometimes in seclusion. Her supporters included some Romanov relatives, who saw something familiar in her voice, her manner, her eyes. But many others rejected her, said she was a fraud, an imposter. A Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, traumatized by war, perhaps deluded, perhaps desperate. Anna Anderson died in 1984, still claiming she was Anastasia. And for many, the mystery endured, a wound that never quite healed. Books were written, films made. In the 1997 animated film Anastasia, the story was softened, spun into a fairy tale. The lost princess returning home, love waiting at the gates, the past forgiven. But truth, dear dreamer, is more patient than fantasy. In the 1990s, DNA testing finally spoke with certainty. Samples from Anna Anderson's remains were compared with living Romanov relatives. She was not Anastasia. She was not a Romanov at all. And yet, something of her story lingers. Because we needed it. The idea that one child escaped. That not all was lost. That sometimes, history spares a single life. In the end, it was not about proof. It was about grief. And grief, as we know, does not always seek truth, only comfort. And so, the myth of Anastasia remains, a candle flickering in the wind, a question whispered into the silence. What if? It is one of history's most haunting endings, a royal family swept into darkness, their lives extinguished in silence, and yet their presence endures. Not on thrones, but on screens, on pages, in dreams. The story of the Romanovs, and especially their final days, has captivated the imagination of writers and filmmakers for over a century. Their tale, so rich in tragedy and grace, lends itself easily to storytelling. It is history soaked in melancholy, and the world has never stopped telling it. It began with memoirs. Survivors of the court, tutors, maids, guards, wrote down what they saw. Some with sorrow, others with bitterness. The first generation of books tried to preserve the truth, or at least the version of truth their memories could hold. But soon, fiction crept in. The mystery of Anastasia, that lingering question mark, opened the door to novels, films, plays. And with each retelling, the Romanovs were reshaped, softened, dramatized. In 1956, Hollywood embraced the legend with Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman. She played the role not just with elegance, but with ache, a woman unsure of her identity, pulled between memory and madness. The film took liberties, of course. The ending was sweetened. But in the theater's flickering dark, a generation wept for a princess who might still be alive. The story returned again in 1997, in a form no one expected, an animated musical. Anastasia, produced by Fox, reimagined the tale as a romantic fantasy. With songs, dancing ghosts, and a love story stitched into the seams. Rasputin became a sorcerer. The revolution a swirling storm. It was not accurate, not even close. But it struck a chord. Children watched it with wide eyes. Adults hummed, "Once upon a December," long after the credits rolled. And in some quiet way, the film gave closure that history never could. It gave her, and all of them, a second life. But not all portrayals were fanciful. Serious dramas followed. Documentaries. Biopics. Russian films like Romanovs, Vencenisnaya Semia tried to capture the quiet dignity of the family's final months. The Last Tsars, a Netflix series released in 2019, blended history and reenactment, reminding the world once again of how fragile power can be. Books, too, have told the story over and over. Nicholas and Alexander by Robert K. Massey, a sweeping, deeply human account, brought the imperial family to life with all their grace and flaws. Massey's own son had hemophilia, and he saw in Alexei not just a prince, but a boy like any other, suffering in a world too large for him. There are novels from every angle, from the children's points of view, from servants, from survivors. Some tell the truth. Some tell what might have been. All are trying to say one thing. Remember them. Not for their crowns. Not for their palaces. But for their love. Their fall. Their humanity. In the soft glow of cinema, and the rustle of old pages, the Romanovs continue to live. And perhaps, dear dreamer, it is through story, not lineage, that their memory endures most tenderly. Beneath the weight of their crowns lay treasure. Not merely gold, not just diamonds, but a kingdom of glitter. The Romanov jewels were among the most magnificent collections the world has ever seen. crowns forged by centuries of empire, sapphires the size of olives, pearls strung like dewdrops, brooches, pendants, tiaras, edge-shaped wonders glinting with secrecy and splendor. But dear dreamer, when an empire falls, its treasures scatter like stars. Before the revolution, the Romanov family held an astonishing wealth of personal and state jewels. The crown regalia alone, kept in the Kremlin, included the imperial crown of Russia, adorned with nearly 5,000 diamonds, and the Orlov diamond, a pale green jewel with a history as tangled as Russia's past. But the personal collection, oh, that was something else entirely. Alexandra, raised in royal austerity, found solace in her jewels, not for vanity, but for meaning. Each piece had significance. A bracelet from her wedding, a fabric egg from Nicholas, gleaming with miniatures of their children, pendants shaped like icons, rings etched with dates, initials, sacred symbols. The Grand Duchesses too had their tokens, delicate tiaras, cameos, bejeweled crosses, often worn for portraits, rarely for pleasure. But when revolution swept through Petrograd, the jewels did not vanish overnight. Some were hidden, sewn into the bodices and corsets of the Romanov daughters during their exile. Others were buried in the Alexander Palace, stuffed into pillowcases, concealed beneath floorboards. A few were sent abroad before the fall, entrusted to relatives, diplomats, distant courts. After the family's murder, the Bolsheviks recovered many of these treasures. Trunks of brooches, diamonds, and pearls were catalogued and sold discreetly. Some were auctioned in Europe to fund the new Soviet regime. Others found their way into the Kremlin Diamond Fund, where they sit even now, behind thick glass and velvet ropes, divorced from the hands that once held them. But some disappeared. Pieces resurfaced years, even decades later. A Romanov sapphire necklace sold quietly at a London jeweler, a tiara worn by an unsuspecting heiress, a fabric egg mistaken for a trinket in an estate sale. The most famous of all, the fabric eggs, were once Easter gifts, delicately crafted, each hiding a surprise. A train, a miniature portrait, a wind-up swan. Of the 50 imperial eggs made for the Romanovs, 43 are known to survive. Some rest in museums, others in the private collections of billionaires, sheiks, oligarchs. Each one a time capsule of love, of opulence, of a world lost to fire and frost. And yet, for all their brilliance, the jewels carry sorrow. Because when you look closely, past the diamonds, past the emeralds, you see the hands that once held them. The girl who wore that tiara only once. The empress who kissed that pendant before sleep. The boy who clutched a jeweled icon in pain. They were not ornaments. They were memory. They are memory still. And so, dear dreamer, the Romanov jewels live on, scattered across vaults and glass cases, across whispered auctions and museum halls. Glimmering fragments of a family whose light, though extinguished, still dances in gold. They came not with crowns, but with conviction. While the Romanovs dined in candlelight and walked beneath painted ceilings, the Bolsheviks plodded beneath street lamps and in crowded flats. Their words were not spoken in court French, but in the blunt syllables of steel workers and soldiers. They believed in no god, no king, no palace that deserved its throne. And so, dear dreamer, as Nicholas watched his empire fade from the garden of Tsarskoye Selo, the revolution that would bury it forever was gathering strength. The seeds were planted long before. At the heart of it was a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as Lenin. Sharp of tongue, unsmiling, exiled more times than he could count. He had watched the Romanovs rule from a distance, his brother executed for trying to kill Nicholas's father. He bore no love for monarchy, only a relentless, burning vision, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In exile, he wrote, planned, waited. And when the Tsar abdicated in 1917, Lenin returned to Russia aboard a sealed train, a gift from Germany, who hoped to fan Russia's chaos into full collapse. He arrived not as a liberator, but as a fuse. The provisional government, weak and wavering, tried to steady the nation after Nicholas's fall. But it was too little, too late. War still raged. Food remained scarce. Soldiers deserted. And the Bolsheviks, radical, ruthless, and organized, seized their moment. By October 1917, they struck. They stormed the Winter Palace, that glittering heart of imperial opulence. It was not a grand battle. No roaring cannons or flaming towers. Just a group of armed men marching through dark corridors, arresting ministers, and proclaiming a new order. The Soviet Union was born in a whisper. But what followed was anything but quiet. Lenin and his comrades, Trotsky among them, brilliant and tireless, began to dismantle the old world. Land was seized. Nobles fled. Religion was outlawed. Private property abolished. The Bolsheviks took the reins of a fractured empire and remade it with fire. They promised peace, land, and bread. But peace brought civil war. The White Army, monarchists, liberals, loyalists, fought to reclaim the Russia they remembered. But the Red Army, disciplined, brutal, ideologically unyielding, crushed resistance with increasing violence. Cities burned. Families starved. The nation bled from every border. And in this furnace, the Romanovs were consumed. The Bolsheviks knew what they represented, not as rulers, but as myth, as rallying cries, as symbols. And so, they were silenced. Not with trial, not with exiles or prisons, but with bullets in a basement. Lenin never spoke of the killings with warmth or pride, only necessity. To him, it was an act of political hygiene. And as the years passed, the Bolsheviks built a new world from the ashes. One without tsars, without saints. One forged in factories, schools, slogans. But memory, dear dreamer, is not so easily banished. And though the Romanovs vanished from history books and school lessons, they survived in whispers, in old photographs hidden in drawers, in candles lit behind curtains. Because even revolutions, for all their fire, cannot fully unwrite. Not all Romanovs died in Ekaterinburg. Beyond the cellar and the silence, scattered across Europe and Asia, there remain branches of the family tree, cousins, uncles, distant kin, who fled the fire just in time, or who happened to be elsewhere when the axe fell. They did not escape untouched. They escaped with memories, with trauma, with luggage hastily packed in names that once opened doors, now whispered behind them. The fall of the Romanovs sent dozens of imperial relatives into exile. Some fled on ships through the Black Sea. Others took trains through war-torn Europe. A few, in desperation, traveled by sleigh through Siberian snow, clutching jewels sewn into the seams of their coats. Among the most prominent was Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, known affectionately as Michin. She fled south with her sons, eventually reaching Romania. Another was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, one of the men who had conspired to kill Rasputin. He escaped and would go on to live in Paris, becoming briefly entwined with Coco Chanel. The largest Romanov exile community formed in France, particularly Paris and the south. There, under softer skies and the rustle of unfamiliar languages, they tried to remake themselves. Not as rulers, but as ordinary people. Some became artists, others jewelers. A few worked in bakeries, in bookstores, in silent corners of foreign embassies. One Romanov princess, Xenia, sold flowers on the streets of London. The grief was not only financial. It was cultural, spiritual. Many Romanovs clung fiercely to memory, to samovars, to Russian orthodoxy, to lullabies hummed in twilight. They gathered for dinners, spoke in the old court Russian, toasted to what once was. They celebrated Orthodox Christmas even as the world moved on. Others tried to forget, to marry, to blend, to slip into the folds of Europe without being noticed. And yet, the name Romanov never truly disappears. It carries echoes. It turns heads. It opens old wounds. In time, some relatives helped preserve the story, donating letters, photographs, heirlooms to museums. Others gave interviews, wrote memoirs, told the world, gently, what it had missed, that Nicholas had been a loving father, that Alexander had been ill, not cruel, that the girls had some, that Alexei had smiled. Their stories became lifeboats in the great tide of history, small, flickering lights that ensured the Romanovs would not be remembered only by how they died. And even now, the Romanov name persists. There are descendants, not of Nicholas, for his line ended in that cellar, but from his cousins and siblings. They live in the US, in Spain, in Germany. Some are quiet. Others still speak of restoration, dreams of a symbolic monarchy in modern Russia. But perhaps the truest legacy is this: that in the cafes of Paris, in the chapels of London, in the quiet corners of old Moscow bookstores, the name still lingers. Not as royalty, but as remembrance. They were not merely wives and daughters. They were witnesses, survivors, vessels of grace in a world unraveling. The Romanov women, both those who perished and those who lived beyond the fall, have long been draped in myth, painted as delicate, tragic, angelic. But behind those lace veils and velvet gowns were minds sharp with memory, and hearts tempered not by privilege, but by pain. Even in life, they bore a kind of duality. They were figures of empire, yes, glittering at balls, immortalized in portraits, names inscribed on silver goblets and pressed into invitations. But they were also mothers, daughters, sisters. They wrote diaries filled not with grand designs, but with the ache of ordinary things, missed letters, stubborn colds, the silence of waiting for a child to heal. When the empire fell, it was the women who bore the first tremors. It was Alexandra who watched her letters go unopened, her prayers unanswered, her son's suffering used against her in whispers that sped like frost through the corridors of power. It was Olga and Tatiana who took up the roles of nurses during the war, their pristine hands stained with iodine and sorrow, their days shaped by moans and blood and the dignity of caring for broken strangers. It was Maria who brought kindness to the guards in Tobolsk, her gaze so soft it made even riflemen hesitate. It was Anastasia who kept the laughter alive when the candles grew thin and the world shrank to a few painted windows. And it was all of them who walked into exile without protest, carrying blankets, Bibles, and the remains of their former world folded into hidden pockets. Even those who escaped, the Grand Duchesses, the Dowager Empresses, the aunts and cousins, carried a silence so profound it echoed louder than any crown. Many never spoke of what they'd seen. They remarried, or did not. They gave interviews, or refused. They kept boxes beneath their beds, filled with letters too painful to read, photographs that faded slowly into ghost light. They lit candles for anniversaries no one else remembered. They wore black not for fashion, but because mourning had become a second skin. To be a Romanov woman in exile was to live as a symbol of something both revered and resented, a past that would not die, and a future they were never allowed to reach. Some were called saints, others impostors. A few, misunderstood and unnamed, lived lives of quiet kindness, their royal names lost beneath layers of time and anonymity. And yet, dear dreamer, it is perhaps these women who preserve the soul of a fallen world. Not in thrones, but in tenderness, in dignity, in the unwavering grace of surviving without bitterness. Their silence was not weakness. It was reverence, a way of honoring those who had no voice left. For the Romanovs, faith was not a symbol. It was a structure, a rhythm, a refuge. It shaped the way they rose, the way they rolled, the way they walked toward death. Russian orthodoxy, ancient and resplendent, was at the very heart of the Romanov identity. Tsars were not merely monarchs. They were gods anointed on earth. Their coronations were liturgies. Their palaces bore chapels like jewels. Their decisions echoed with scripture. And for Nicholas II, that mantle was not merely ceremonial. He believed deeply. His diary is filled not with declarations of power, but with prayers. His letters to Alexandra often ended with icons drawn in ink. He knelt not just for show, but for guidance, not from ministers, but from saints. He confessed. He communed. He sought God not only in cathedrals, but in the quiet, aching corners of family life. Alexandra's faith, too, was fierce, almost mystical. Her conversion to orthodoxy upon marriage was more than political. She immersed herself in its rhythms, its saints, its sorrows. She became deeply devoted, especially after the birth of Alexei. Her prayers multiplied as his health declined. Her belief in divine intervention deepened, which is partly what drew her into the orbit of Rasputin, a man who promised miracles when medicine could not. Together, Nicholas and Alexandra built a spiritual haven for their children. The Grand Duchesses wore crosses from childhood. They fasted. They sang hymns. They attended services not just for ceremony, but for solace. Olga and Tatiana read the Gospels regularly. Anastasia whispered nighttime prayers even in captivity. And Alexei, frail and suffering, was often described as devout beyond his years, offering childlike prayers with heartbreaking clarity. Even in exile, their faith did not break. When they were forbidden from attending church, they made chapels of whatever rooms they could. They lined icons along bookshelves, painted crosses on walls, stitched prayers into handkerchiefs. Nicholas served as the family's priest, leading daily prayers, reading psalms aloud when hope felt thin. In their final moments, it is said they clung to these sacred rituals. Icons in their hands, crosses around their necks, psalms in their hearts. And after death, faith followed. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanovs as passion bearers, saints not because they performed miracles, but because they bore their suffering with Christ-like humility. The church on the blood now rises over the site of their execution. Its altars shimmer with their faces. Pilgrims gather not to mourn an empire, but to venerate a family who forgave their killers before the guns were drawn. Their sainthood remains a point of reverent debate, not because of who they were, but because of what they became. Symbols of endurance, of repentance, of that quiet, aching faith that kneels in the dark and says still, "Thy will be done." And so, dear dreamer, the Romanovs live on in the glow of candlelight, in the liturgies sung beneath golden domes, in the soft hush of prayers whispered on anniversaries the world forgets, but the soul remembers. History rarely moves in straight lines, dear dreamer. It bends. It hides. It stutters. And when blood is spilled in silence, when a family vanishes beneath a tide of bullets and no trial is held, no names confessed, no guilt properly claimed, the wound does not close. It waits. For years, there was no justice for the Romanovs. Only shadows. The Soviet government never publicly acknowledged the murders in full during its reign. It spoke of necessary acts, of counter-revolutionary symbols, of endings required by revolution. For the Bolsheviks, the deaths were not tragedies, they were tactics. Executions rendered not by courts, but by ideology. Yakov Yurovsky, the man who led the firing squad, never faced a trial. He died in 1938, having written a detailed report of the murders, a grim, emotionless account that would only emerge decades later. Other participants faded quietly into Soviet anonymity, their names known only to archivists and the curious few who dared to remember. When the Romanov remains were unearthed in the late 20th century, and the truth of their deaths fully emerged from archival silence, Russia found itself at a crossroads. What was to be done? Could a country born from revolution truly grieve the monarch it overthrew? In 1998, on the 80th anniversary of their deaths, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were reburied in state with Orthodox rites, a ceremony that felt as much like repentance as remembrance. President Boris Yeltsin stood at the tomb and called the murders a disgrace, a wound in the soul of Russia. And yet, even that gesture sparked controversy. Some saw it as healing, others saw it as betrayal, a revisionist nod to a past they had tried to bury. Legal efforts followed. The Romanov descendants filed appeals. Debates flared in courts and parliament. Should the family be officially exonerated? Should the state apologize not with flowers, but with the law? In 2008, the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation ruled that Nicholas and his family were victims of political repression and formally rehabilitated them. But no one stood trial. No one was named. No one punished. Because history, as it turns out, does not offer courtroom closure. What remains is not justice in the legal sense, but a kind of quiet moral reckoning, a lingering sadness that an entire family was erased not for what they did, but for what they represented. And perhaps that is why their story endures. Because it asks us to consider, how do we hold power to account without cruelty? How do we rewrite the future without annihilating the past? Because justice, dear dreamer, is not always a gavel. Sometimes it is a candle lit in a chapel, a name spoken aloud, a truth taught to children who deserve to know both the horror and the humanity of those who came before. And in that, perhaps, the Romanovs are finding, not vengeance, but peace. There are voices in history that don't shout. They whisper. And the diaries of the Romanov children, scrawled in soft cursive, inked with rose-colored pens, doodled with flowers and initials, offer not proclamations, but glimpses. They are not grand. They are not edited for legacy. They are honest, gentle, sometimes unbearably small. And that, dear dreamer, is what makes them so powerful. Each child kept a journal. It was tradition in the imperial household to reflect, to record, to write one's day into memory. But over time, those pages became more than habit. They became safe places. Sanctuaries where hope could be tucked between lines. Alda's diary is perhaps the most haunting. She was the eldest, thoughtful, poetic, deeply aware. Her early entries are filled with light observations, walks in the garden, tea with mama, music lessons, news from the front. But as revolution crept in, her tone darkened. She wrote of the gods, of the silence, of the ache in her heart. One entry reads simply, "Everything is so sad, so lonely. We pray. We wait. The sun is warm but does not comfort." Tatiana, always precise, kept her diary like she kept her life, in order. Her handwriting was neat, her words careful. She noted her duties as a nurse during the war, the names of patients, the details of bandages and fevers. Even in exile, she tracked daily chores, readings, games. There's a quiet strength in her lines, a resolve that tries not to break, even as the world unravels. Maria's diary is filled with tenderness. She was emotional, affectionate, always noticing others. She wrote of her sisters, of the kindness or cruelty of gods, of dreams of marriage and family. Her entries are often interrupted by sketches, of birds, of crosses, of little faces. She worried for her mother. She tried to be brave for Alexei and Anastasia. Her diary is a whirlwind of humor and heartache. Jokes, wordplay, complaints about lessons, silly rhymes. She doodled constantly, little animals, caricatures of servants, hearts around names. But beneath the mischief were moments of sudden clarity. She wrote once, "We are not afraid. We are all together, and that is everything." And little Alexei, though his diary is more sparse, and often written with help, left behind a few pages too. Descriptions of his toy soldiers, his dog Joy, of pain that never went away, and a mother who never stopped praying beside his bed. In Tobolsk and Ekaterinburg, the diaries became more precious. The girls wrote on scraps, margins, even the edges of old letters. They hid them beneath pillows. Some pages were destroyed. Others survived in trunks, passed through war and wanderings, until finally they arrived in museums, archives, haunts. Reading them is like overhearing ghosts, not frightening, but tender. You hear their footsteps again, their laughter, their longing, and you remember, they were not statues. They were children, writing down a world as it quietly died. They rolled an empire that stretched from the forests of Poland to the shores of the Pacific. But the legacy of the last Romanovs does not rest in maps. It rests in memory, and in the strange, sacred way they continue to move through our world, long after their bodies were laid to rest beneath marble and pine. For many, Nicholas and Alexander remain cautionary figures, symbols of power too rigid to bend, too blind to see what change demanded. To their critics, they represent the tragic consequences of insulated rule, the failure to adapt, to reform, to respond. And that is part of their legacy. But not all. For others, they are something softer. A family, loving, fragile, undeserving of the brutal end they met. They are not remembered for wars or decrees, but for diary entries, for lullabies, for the way Nicholas cradled his hemophiliac son in the snow, or the way Anastasia danced to rooms when sorrow grew too loud. The legacy is complex, as most true stories are. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized them not as martyrs in the traditional sense, but as passion bearers, those who faced death with grace, who forgave, who suffered without bitterness. This alone has rekindled a reverence that political history cannot. In modern Russia, their memory is stitched into the national fabric in strange and shifting ways. There are statues. There are postage stamps. There are candles lit on July 17th, every year, by thousands of pilgrims who walk in silence through the forest paths where their bodies were once discarded. But beyond religion, beyond politics, something more human endures. Museums house their belongings: a child's shoe, a prayer book, a lock of hair. School children read about them now not as villains, but as human beings. Artists sketch them. Composers write for them. Writers, like your humble companion here, whisper their stories into the dusk. Even in exile, their descendants, the distant branches of the Romanov tree, have carried forward not a right to rule, but a duty to remember. They speak of reconciliation, not restoration, of preserving the truth, not reliving a fantasy. And perhaps that, dear dreamer, is the real legacy. Not empire, not power, but the slow return of tenderness. The understanding that even those who wore crowns were not above sorrow. That even those raised in palaces knew grief. That history, when it pauses to listen, really listen, can turn even its most tragic tales into lullabies. The Romanovs left behind no kingdom, but they left behind a feeling, a stillness, a reverence, a reminder that all things pass, and some things remain. In the grand gallery of royal marriages, often forged in strategy and sealed with cold hands, the love between Nicholas and Alexander burns with an intimacy so rare, so real, it feels almost out of place. They were, before anything else, soulmates. And in that quiet, persistent devotion, they both found sanctuary and ruin. Their love story began, as all tender ones do, with unlikely beginnings. Alex of Hesse, shy, serious, burdened by early grief, met Nicholas Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, not as a subject to a ruler, but as a young girl to a bashful boy. She was 12, he 16. At first glance, it was nothing. But in time, and through letters that danced across Europe, that small spark grew. And when they married in 1894, days after Nicholas's father died, their union was not just romantic. It was defiant. Alexandra converted to Orthodoxy, left behind her homeland, and stepped into a foreign world where she would never quite be embraced. And yet Nicholas adored her. Not in the cold, ceremonial way so often seen in monarchs, but tenderly, constantly. He wrote her letters daily, sometimes twice, calling her, "My own beloved wifey, my sunshine, my darling Alex." His words were filled with longing, with gentleness, with the kind of sweetness one doesn't expect from an emperor. Alexander returned his devotion fiercely. In Nicholas, she found not just a husband, but an anchor. A man who, for all his flaws, never wavered in his love. She needed that certainty, especially as her health faltered, as motherhood brought both joy and heartbreak, and as the pressures of the throne began to weigh. They were never more united than in their love for their children, especially Alexei, their frail, precious boy. Together, they created a cocoon of intimacy within the palace. While ministers and monarchists plotted outside, inside was tea, music, Bible readings, embroidery, long walks. They were, in a way, remarkably ordinary in their domesticity, a family of 7 wrapped in each other's company. But love, dear dreamer, does not shield one from consequence. Their closeness became isolation. Their loyalty to each other became distrust of others. Alexandra, plagued by illness and fear, relied more and more on mysticism, on Rasputin, on a circle that narrowed dangerously. Nicholas, paralyzed by indecision, deferred to her too often, believing her instincts divine. And so, while they prayed together, wrote love notes, and knelt at their icon-filled altar, their empire slipped away. In exile, their bond only deepened. They slept in adjoining rooms, held hands during walks, shared their meals with quiet dignity. They did not blame each other. They did not argue. They faced the end not with grandeur, but with grace. On the final night, it was Alexandra who asked for chairs in the cellar, for herself and her son. Nicholas stood beside her, his gaze steady, his fingers perhaps brushing hers one last time. They died as they lived, together. Not just Tsar and Empress, but husband and wife. And though their role may be judged by history's cold scale, their love, steadfast, unadorned, unbroken, remains untouched. A candle that refused to go out, even when the room grew dark. In a world of porcelain teacups and icy crowns, it was often the animals, soft, loyal, and unburdened by politics, who offered the Romanovs their most unconditional love. The family adored animals. Their palaces teemed with them, dogs, cats, birds, even cows. They were not simply pets. They were family. Each child had their favorites, each companion had a name, a place by the fire, a presence in diary entries and letters. Alexei, the delicate heir, had a special fondness for dogs. His most faithful companion was a spaniel named Joy, a cheerful, amber-eyed dog who followed him everywhere. Through his worst nights of bleeding and pain, Joy never left his side. Even in exile, when servants were dismissed and possessions taken away, Joy remained. In the bitter confusion after the family's execution, Joy was found, alive, trembling, but unharmed. He was taken by a British officer and brought eventually to Windsor, where he lived out his days quietly in England. It's said he often looked toward doors that never opened, waiting for footsteps that never came. The Grand Duchesses too had their beloved creatures. Maria and Anastasia shared a cat they called Vaska and were often seen playing with kittens in palace gardens. Tatiana, ever graceful, preferred dogs. She kept a French bulldog named Ordipole, a gift from a wounded soldier during her time as a nurse. During their exile in Tobolsk, the girls even befriended chickens and a tame squirrel. They fed them crumbs, named them, laughed at their antics. Tiny flickers of joy amid the encroaching gloom. Alexandra, who often retreated into silence when her nerves frayed, found comfort in the presence of small animals. She would stroke their fur absent-mindedly during long prayers, as if grounding herself to something alive, something pure, something that did not whisper treason. But exile took a toll on even the smallest friends. When the Romanovs were moved from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg, not all the animals were allowed to come. Some were left behind. Others smuggled quietly. Even in the final days, the girls kept birds, small songbirds in cages they tended like tiny altars of normalcy. And when the end came, some were with them. Joy, of course. And Ordipole, though accounts differ on her final fate. A few birds were found, quiet in their cages. There were traces of scattered grain, of small footprints near makeshift food bowls. History does not usually pause for pets. But in this story, they remain soft, warm threads woven through the coldness of war and downfall. Because animals do not care for empires. They do not ask who wears the crown. They offer only presence, only love. And perhaps that's why their loyalty pierces deepest. They stayed when others fled. They watched quietly when the world grew dark. And somewhere, dear dreamer, a little dog named Joy once lay beside a boy who would never grow up, offering, in his final hours, the one thing no empire could promise. Unquestioning, enduring love. There is something sacred about a final letter. It is a thread stretched toward the future, written by hands that won't live to feel it. It's a voice suspended in time, a breath preserved, as if the writer could reach across the chasm and whisper, "Remember me." The Romanovs, even as their world grew narrower, kept writing. They wrote to family, to friends, to one another. Some letters were smuggled out. Others were intercepted, kept in archives unread for decades. A few, miraculously, made it to their intended homes. They do not read like royal dispatches. They read like what they truly were, the words of a family preparing for an end they could not name, not yet, In exile at Tobolsk, Nicholas wrote often to his mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, who had escaped to Crimea. His letters were steady, restrained, filled with fatherly pride. He mentioned Alexei's health, the girls' daily chores, the long walks in snow. But beneath the even tone was something else. A man trying to make the ordinary feel enough. Trying to shelter his mother from the truth. Alexandra's letters were different. More emotional. More urgent. She wrote in a mixture of Russian, English, and German, her thoughts tumbling out in soft, desperate script. She often quoted scripture. She spoke of God's will, of her trust in his plan. But she also confessed fear. Worry for Alexei. Fatigue that no prayer seemed to lift. She clung to the hope that her relatives abroad, particularly in Germany and Britain, might still intervene. Her letters spoke of faith, but read like waiting. The girls, too, wrote. Ulda's last known letter was to a close friend. She wrote with aching honesty. Father asked to remember us in your prayers. Nothing else remains for us. Tatiana, always the organizer, penned small notes to friends and relatives, sending greetings, asking about books, trying to keep the tone light. But each word seemed weighed. Maria wrote gently to an old tutor, sending affection, reminiscing. Her language was softer, as though she still believed in ordinary things. Anastasia's final notes, some scribbled on scraps, some more carefully phrased, show her trying to stay cheerful, even when she knew better. And then there were the letters to each other, fragments of love passed hand to hand within their confined world. Folded prayers, birthday wishes, quiet words of encouragement, a hand squeezing another in script. Their final known writings came just days before the end. A short note from Alexandra to one of their few remaining servants. A passage copied by Oldane to her diary. A poem, perhaps, or a prayer. Send us patience, Lord, in the dark days to come. And then, silence. No grand declarations. No dramatic farewells. Just small words. As fragile as their final breaths. But those letters, now preserved in museums, in archives, in glass cases beneath low lights, remain. Not just as documents. As voices. Still speaking. Still reaching. Still reminding us that even in their final hours, the Romanovs were not emperors, not symbols, not saints. They were a family, writing their way into memory. It is rare, dear dreamer, for a fallen dynasty to linger so long in the world's imagination. And yet, more than a century after their final breath, the Romanovs continue to haunt bookshelves, museum halls, silver screens, and whispered stories passed across dinner tables and digital pages alike. Why? Why do they endure, when so many other kings and queens have faded into dust? Perhaps it is the tragedy, sharp, sudden, irreversible. An entire family, elegant and affectionate, wiped from the earth in a single night, without trial, without mercy. It strikes the human heart with that peculiar ache we feel for innocence lost, for endings that were not earned, for goodbyes never spoken. But tragedy alone does not hold us so long. The fascination also lies in contrast. The Romanovs were born into splendor, into a world of Faberge eggs and palace balls, of coronations gleaming with diamonds and saints. And yet they died in a cellar, under a bare bulb, without titles, without even time to cross themselves. From opulence to oblivion. That arc is hard to look away from. Then there's the mystery. The long years when no one knew where their bodies lay, when rumors flourish like frost across glass. The tales of Anastasia's escape, of hidden treasures, of secret survivors. Even now, fragments of those legends remain. Not because we believe them, but because we want to. We want the story to continue. We want one child to be spared. We want to believe that fate, so often cruel, might have blinked just once. And beyond the story itself, there is something about the Romanovs that feels achingly human. They were not tyrants, nor were they saints. They were flawed, isolated, devout, loving. In photographs, they do not look like rulers. They look like any family caught between generations. Laughing children, protective parents, longing, laughter, faith. When we look at them, we see ourselves, not in their palaces, but in their quiet moments. And so the world has held them gently. Writers from every continent have told their story. Tourists from faraway lands walk the cold paths in Ekaterinburg. Artists paint them. Filmmakers cast actors with soft eyes and soft voices to echo their memory. Even in nations far from Russia, there's something universal in their story, of love stretched thin by history, of faith tested by fire, of the quiet dignity of facing the end together. It is not just royalty that captivates. It is tenderness. It is grief. It is the reminder that behind every headline, every title, every crown is a heartbeat. And the Romanovs, for all the splendor that once surrounded them, have become, strangely, more beloved in death than in life. Because their story touches something in all of us. The child who fears the dark. The parent who prays for strength. The soul that hopes to be remembered. In the wake of revolutions, what remains? Not crowns, not banners, but places, sacred by sorrow, silent by design, where history lingers like candle smoke. And in Russia, where the Romanovs once ruled with divine right, those places have become destinations not of celebration, but of reflection. Historical tourism, dear dreamer, has blossomed not around their triumphs, but their tragedy. Ekaterinburg, once just an industrial city nestled at the edge of Siberia, has become a point of pilgrimage, not for the curious, but for the reverent. Where Ipatiev House once stood, the site of their execution, now rises the church on the blood. Built between 2000 and 2003, it is both majestic and mournful. White stone, gold domes, icons of the royal martyrs glimmering against walls washed in candlelight. Inside, beneath vaulted arches, visitors kneel, not to rulers, but to saints. Every July 17th, in the soft dark before dawn, tens of thousands gather. They hold candles. They walk in silence. They retrace the final journey the family took, from the city to Ganaina Yama, the forest clearing where their bodies were first discarded. That path, some 15 miles long, is called the Royal Passion Bearer's Way. It winds through trees, across wooden bridges, beside small chapels built in honor of each family member. Pilgrims walk it with solemn steps. Some chant. Others whisper prayers. Many weep, not just for what happened, but for what it means. In St. Petersburg, the Peter and Paul Fortress draws visitors too. It was once a prison. Now, it's the final resting place of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their children. Their marble tombs lie beside their imperial ancestors, beneath the soaring cathedral where gold reflects off pale faces carved in stone. Tourists enter on guided tours. But many pause. They lower their voices. They read the names slowly. They stare at portraits, not because they seek royalty, but because they feel the hush of something unfinished. Even Tobolsk, remote and snow-draped, welcomes the curious. The governor's mansion where the Romanovs lived in exile has been carefully restored. Visitors can walk the rooms where the children once embroidered, where Nicholas chopped wood, where Alexandra prayed beside her son's sickbed. The walls do not speak, but the silence is thick with story. And then there are the small places. A playground in Levadia, where Alexei once ran with his sisters. The Crimea's chalky shores, where the Empress once dreamed of building a hospital. A rose bush, long dead, that someone replanted where Anastasia once tied ribbons. These places, scattered unassuming, remind us that history is not only read. It is walked. It is touched. It is breathed. And so, dear dreamer, the fall of the Romanovs has given rise to a different kind of empire, one not of subjects, but of seekers. People who travel not for spectacle, but for connection. For that intimate ache of standing where sorrow once stood. Because sometimes, the most powerful history is not found in textbooks. It is found in footsteps. Long after their crowns were shattered and their portraits removed from palace walls, the Romanovs found new life, not in politics, but in art. For what is art, dear dreamer, if not the heart's way of remembering? Painters, composers, poets, dancers, all have reached back through the mist of history to touch the Romanovs once more, not as sovereigns, but as symbols. symbols of innocence, of devotion, of the fragile beauty that so often slips between the fingers of power. In music, their story has inspired both requiems and lullabies. Composers like John Tavener, with his haunting, funeral echoes, sought to express the spiritual ache of their martyrdom. Choral pieces rise with solemnity, often sung in Russian, echoing the same orthodox prayers the family once whispered at dusk. Modern composers have followed, blending Eastern liturgy with Western sorrow. Their melodies carry images, Olga lighting a candle, Alexei dreaming of sledding again, Anastasia laughing in a long, echoing hall. And in ballet, that most Russian of arts, their legacy is stitched quietly beneath the tutus and tulle. Not just in direct retellings, but in atmosphere. Tchaikovsky, long before their fall, captured the melancholy of Russian nobility in every sweeping string. Later, choreographers would use Romanov-inspired themes, exile, memory, sacrifice, to shape movements that seemed to grieve even as they danced. In visual art, their images have never left us. Their official portraits, of course, once adorned every palace corridor. But today, artists around the world reimagine them in oils and ink, in charcoal and watercolor. Not as rulers, but as ghosts. There are canvases of Anastasia reaching toward light she cannot find. Of Nicholas standing in a snowstorm, his hands open but empty. Of Alexandra weeping into a prayer book. Art students sketch them not because they were perfect, but because they were human, and beautiful in their undoing. Even in fashion, their aesthetic whispers from runways and royal-inspired gowns. Designers have recreated Alexandra's pro-lace gowns, the Grand Duchess's Edwardian silhouettes. The Romanov influence, romantic, tragic, ornate, reemerges every decade or so, when the world once again longs for elegance touched by grief. And poetry. Oh, dear dreamer, the poetry. Anna Akhmatova, Marina Tsareva. Even in the early Soviet years, these poets mourned quietly, not just the Romanovs themselves, but the world that disappeared with them. Verses of candles blown out, of sisters never found, of footsteps lost in snow. Today, modern poets still write them back into being, giving Alexander voice, letting Alexei ask why, letting Olga describe the stars through the bars of a window. It is not hagiography. It is healing. A way for the world to say what was never said, to weep without shame, to remember with art what history tried to forget. And so, the Romanovs, long silenced, speak again through cello, through brash to rhyme. Because art, unlike power, endures not through fear, but through feeling. And feelings, dear dreamer, never die. For much of the 20th century, the Romanovs were not remembered. They were erased. In Soviet classrooms, their names were footnotes. In public, they were painted as tyrants, relics of a cruel, outdated system. Their portraits disappeared from walls. Their palaces became museums, or hospitals, or ruins. Their children, once adored across the empire, became enemies of the people, reduced to silence. But history, dear dreamer, has a long memory. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the ice began to thaw. Russia, raw, reeling, reborn, began to look backward as it looked forward. In the rubble of revolution, people reached for what had been lost. Not to restore the monarchy, but to reclaim the story, the truth, the tenderness. Suddenly, the Romanovs reappeared. Old photographs were republished, the ones with sun-dappled picnics and summer dresses, with Nicholas in a hammock, with Alexandra playing piano. Memoirs once forbidden found new readers. Museums reopened wings dedicated to the last imperial family. But more than that, there was reverence. In 1998, after decades of searching and quiet investigation, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their children were finally interred with honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral of St. Petersburg, where Romanovs had been buried for centuries. The funeral was broadcast across the nation. A simple wooden cross led the procession. Cossacks in full regalia stood vigil. A priest read Orthodox prayers, the same prayers Alexander had murmured in captivity. President Boris Yeltsin, standing before their tombs, called their deaths a disgrace on our history. and urged the country to reflect, not with shame, but with solemnity. In that moment, it seemed Russia was not just burying a family, it was laying to rest the silence. And yet, the journey of remembrance was not easy. There were debates, denials, disagreements about sainthood, about DNA, about how and whether to honor those once cast out. Some embraced them as saints. Others, still wary of monarchy, resisted. But across the years, the movement to remember only grew stronger. Churches were built. Pilgrimages began. The Romanovs were canonized in 2000 by the Russian Orthodox Church as passion bearers, not for political martyrdom, but for facing death with grace and forgiveness. Their icons now hang beside those of saints long past. Their names are spoken not in judgment, but in prayer. And among ordinary Russians, not scholars or clergy, a kind of quiet affection took root. Families lit candles on July 17th. Children learned their names again. Visitors left flowers at old palaces, not for the glory of empire, but for the sorrow of its fall. Even today, in the complicated swirl of Russian identity, the Romanovs are not a symbol of returning to old rule. They are something gentler, a reminder that behind every upheaval, there are people. That history is not just revolution and reform, it is faces, families, love lost. And as Russia continues to wrestle with its past, to heal, to stumble, to remember, the Romanovs stand not as rulers over the present, but as quiet companions to its future. So here we are, dear dreamer. 40 candlelit steps to a story as tragic as it is tender. The Romanovs, once rulers of the largest empire on earth, now belong not to thrones, but to time. And time, when given gentleness, does not forget. It cradles. It breathes. It watches the past not as pages to be turned, but as faces to be remembered. And what do we remember? Not just Nicholas, the hesitant Tsar who loved train rides and hated decisions. Not just Alexandra, the nervous empress who longed for stillness and clung to her faith like a lifeline. Not only the children, all this poetry, Tatiana's quiet strength, Maria's warm heart, Anastasia's laughter, Alexei's brave little soul. We remember the candlelight, the slow evenings in Tobolsk, the hymns sung in exile, the way they said grace, even when grace seemed nowhere to be found. We remember their letters, not to ministers or monarchs, but to friends, to mothers, to each other. We remember the dogs by their feet, the snow on their windowsills, the softness of a bedtime prayer whispered on a July night. They were not just a dynasty undone by revolution. They were a family, trying, in the end, to hold on to each other as the world let go. And now, they belong to us. To every reader who lights a candle and dot. To every pilgrim who walks through the forest toward a little wooden chapel. To every dreamer who wonders how such beauty and sorrow could exist in the same breath. And they remain, not in marble alone, but in the flicker of candlelight on a winter evening, in the hum of a lullaby, in the soft hush of pages turning in an old diary. So rest now, dear dreamer. Let the Romanovs walk gently into your thoughts, not as ghosts, but as gentle figures bathed in twilight. Let them remind you, not of crowns, but of kindness. Not of endings, but of how love, when held tight enough, echoes far beyond death. Close your eyes. Let their story fade into shadow. Let the quiet wrap around you. The candles are low now. The stars are listening. And somewhere, in the soft fold of history, a family stands together still, smiling, waiting, remembered. Rest well, dear dreamer. Until next time.